All right, let's go ahead and get started. So the plan for today is I'll just give a brief introduction to the book, how we're going to talk about the book today, and then we can go ahead and get started in our discussion. So again, my name is Sarah Rozier. I'm really happy to see some new names, and I'll be happy to hear from everybody in a second. But I am the news editor for Ballotpedia. I am based outside Washington, D.C., and so it was really exciting for me to read this book because I am definitely within the bubble. I've grown up within the bubble, but have lots of family in Western Pennsylvania and throughout the Rust Belt. So it's always books like Hillbilly Elegy and those types of in-depth research onto who these different voters across the country are has always been a very interesting topic for me. So today we're just going to talk about what our most interesting takeaways were from the Great Revolt, and I'll just kind of get us started. So the thing that I found most fascinating from how Selena and Brad approached this was their methodology. They didn't come in with any preconceived narratives about what they'd find out about these voters. They took it very qualitatively and then developed these buckets and these archetypes that we read about throughout. And to hear them talk about it, we did a short little Q&A with them last week to hear them talk about it. And they avoid interstates, they avoid chain restaurants. Selena never takes the highways to places. She's always cutting through town to try to meet the people and talk about the specific issues that are plaguing their towns, that they're proud of their towns for. So to me, the biggest takeaway was, unlike all the other big think pieces we've read about the Rust Belt voters in 2016, Selena was on the ground. She was specifically talking to the locals. She wasn't addressing any of the chains or anything like that. So that's kind of been my biggest takeaway from the books, to start thinking about, if you had to summarize what you liked about it, or the qualms you had about their research methodology, or even what archetype was your favorite or most interesting to read about, start thinking about that. But I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Palais real quick. He's our editor-in-chief, and Jeff, I'll kind of present the question to you, and then we'll talk about it as a group here after that.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. It's really exciting for us to open up a book club conversation to readers. It's an exciting opportunity for us to get to know and interact with our audience as an organization that is primarily remote-based. Each one where we all work from our homes, as you can see behind us if you're looking at the Zoom platform. It's nice to see another face once in a while. It's nice to actually hear and interact with our readers. We had planned on a larger turnout for this book club. It probably shouldn't surprise me that some people might have had something come up or had some technical difficulties. If a few people come in a little bit later throughout this call, we had planned on breaking off into two separate groups. Right now, though, with this size group, we'll probably just stick in one group. So we'll see how that goes as the few stragglers we can see start coming in. So, yeah, as Sarah said, we're really excited to dig into this book, in part because at Ballotpedia, it's so crucial and core and central to our mission and what we do to understand our readers and to understand what our readers are thinking about the issues. And by our readers, we mean all Americans, everyone, which means you have to understand multiple sides of the issue, multiple sides of the narrative. It's like if you look at our ballot measure articles, it's very crystal clear. There's the support side and there's an opposition side. And we are fair to both. We want to understand both. Most of the election analysis that came out that Sarah was alluding to, you'd often hear people write or say things to the effect of, I don't understand these voters. I don't understand what happened in 2016. And we hear that and we think, well, okay, but it's really important for us to understand what happened so that we can understand how best to serve our readers and how best to fairly and neutrally cover the issues. So this book was just a really great breath of fresh air for us, and really an enjoyable read and a great series of human interest stories. And it was wonderful, like Sarah said, to get to know the authors last week. So I'm kind of in a long-winded way of getting at my big takeaway, which is just that the people who voted for President Trump in the last election that are featured in this book, they were very deliberate in their decision, and they have a very long view approach to their vote. They are more patient, I think, than media coverage would indicate. So that was kind of a really big takeaway. I'm just really excited to hear what everyone on the call thinks as well, and I look forward to having a fun little conversation here for the next 20 minutes or so. So with that, I'll take it back to Sarah to facilitate from here.
Jeff, so just so we have, everybody can kind of talk about their perspective of an American. Where are you based out of? So we're all.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot about that part. So I'm based out of Charleston, South Carolina.
Great. So what I'll do is, real quick, if Sarah Ansel and Sarah Grote want to just say who you are, what you do at Ballotpedia, and your location, and then I'll ask everybody who's on this call. And like Jeff said, we are all remote, so my cat is never around except when I'm talking. So if you see a cat tail, I'm trying to knock him off. But Sarah Ansel, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself for everybody here?
Yeah, hey everyone. My name is Sarah Ansel. I work for Ballotpedia. I help out Jeff, our editor-in-chief. And I'm currently based in Wellington, Florida, as of about 3 weeks ago. I just moved from the Pacific Northwest in Oregon, and this, I think, is the 8th state I've lived in. So I've enjoyed living in a bunch of different places in the U.S., which kind of contributed to my enjoyment of this book.
So Sarah, when you traveled from Oregon to Florida, did you not take any highways like Selena?
As cool as that would have been, I think it would have made the trip take about 20 days. So I did use some highways.
Perfect. Sarah Grote, real quick, do you want to say hello to everybody?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Sarah Grote. I'm a communications associate here at Ballotpedia. I currently reside in Seattle, Washington. I've been here for about a year and a half, but I'm from Virginia originally. So I've also lived in quite a few places, which made this book really fun to read.
Okay, great. So that's our staff on the call. I'm just going to go through if you just want to say your name and where you're from, and then we'll get going with the discussion. Again, just to give a geographical background to everybody as we get started here. So I'll just go down in alphabetical order. Alan, if you want to unmute yourself and just say where you're from.
Hi, yes, hi, I'm Alan Flanagan. I'm actually from Fort Smith, Arkansas. I'm a general surgeon. Unfortunately, I haven't got this book finished, but I thought I would sit in on the book review as just participate and be a fly on the wall. But thank you for having me.
Perfect. Thanks, Alan. Nice to meet you. Elizabeth, how about you?
From Las Vegas, Nevada, a retiree, and wanting to hear people's perspectives as well.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Karen, how about you?
Hi, I actually live in England. I live in Birmingham, but I vote in Colorado because I still pay my taxes, so they get to hear from me. And yeah, this is a great book, and a great inaugural book, so I really appreciate the recommendation, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Perfect, thanks. We have a few staffers abroad right now, so I'm sure they know the pain of living and paying in different places. And Nancy, how about you?
Hi, I live in on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, Stevensville, Maryland, and I'm a retired government employee, and I loved the book. I never would have read it had it not been for Ballotpedia making the recommendation.
Oh, that's great to hear. And I'm on the western shore of the bay. I'm in Calvert County. I lived in North Beach for a while, and now I'm in Dunkirk. So good to always have a fellow Marylander.
Yeah, and I wanted to just tell your coworker there that I moved from Oregon to Florida in May a while back, and it was a very tough transition. I wish her well.
Thank you very much.
Great. So I'm just going to kick it off. I just want to hear, whoever wants to get started first, what was your main takeaway from the book? What did you find most interesting or illuminating about the group of people, Selena and Brad spoke to. I'll open it up if anybody wants to unmute.
Well, I'd be happy to get started. This is Karen. I also found the book quite refreshing in that so much of what I read is so partisan. It was great to just read some facts, some descriptions of people and what they thought, and direct quotes without, I didn't feel very much emotional language around it. It was amazing how they got into people's heads. And you really got to feel like you knew the people. The little maps at the beginning of the chapters were also super helpful to understand like where these people were. That was great. The most interesting group, I thought, was the rough rebounders. And especially people who had like never voted for anyone before and, you know, over decades and decades, and this is what got them to vote. I found that fascinating. People's stories about the hardship they've been in and how they use that to relate to people, relate to the candidate, was pretty interesting to me. I never would have, like, if I had to write down some archetypes, I would have gotten the first few, but I never would have thought of someone like a rough rebounder and just someone who's been through a lot, taking common cause with Trump for him having been through a lot. So that was completely fascinating to me. So yeah, the archetypes were super helpful to organize my thinking, and I had thoughts I hadn't had before, for sure.
Were there any archetypes that surprised anybody in addition to the rough rebounders, or portions of the archetypes that were surprising?
Did any of them surprise you, Phil? Did any of them surprise you, the archetypes?
Jeff, did you have any from some of our book discussions internally previously? What did you find as a common theme?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I love the human and interest sides of all of those the different archetypes that they come up with. I guess the part that keeps standing up to me as I was thinking about that question, that comment of the sort of refreshing nature of the book. You know, you can imagine in our world and what we do on a day-to-day basis, even though I live in Charleston and our staff are dispersed, we're sort of immersed in the political news of the day-to-day cycle every day. And a common word usage that you see in news stories pretty much from all across the aisle is something to the effect of must-read story. That'll be in a lot of the political newsletters or headlines, must read or shocking, shattering, breaking story. And as I read this book, I got to realize most of the people interviewed by Selena Zito and Brad Todd would have a completely opposite reaction to those newsletters. They would see an article that said must read, and they would think, I don't care. So the interests and what drives consumers of political information it was really revealing how just out of touch, I guess you could say, the sort of mainstream media political coverage is relative to what some of these voters and citizens really cared about. So that was really stark. I don't know if anybody else observed the same kind of thing, but just it was very clear their interest, and they felt sort of aggrieved by it. There was a selection on page 165 where they were saying, I forget it was, one of the readers said, "We were here in plain sight if anyone cared to listen. We still are. That sentiment has not gone away. But the professional reporters in professional Washington still does not get it. They drone on and on every day, either on social media or on networks, and report with just enough interference that you know that they find his win not legitimate. It is as if our votes were not legitimate." I suspect that sentiment hasn't really gone away. That really presents a big challenge for anybody who writes about politics in this country. And we think about this every day when we think about our own coverage. How do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, definitely. Alan, Elizabeth, or Karen, do you have any thoughts to that?
I definitely do. Jeff, you're totally right in how disconnected it seemed between the mainstream media and what I read all the time, and what those people thought. But I think kind of from both sides. So not only did the mainstream media not understand the people in the book, several of the people in the book seem to have a completely different understanding of the world, of the economy, of the candidate than I do. And not just like disagree politically, but seem to have a different set of facts than I have experienced in my life. Not to say that they're wrong, but it was interesting to read people who just see things so differently, and apparently have read and experienced like 100% different things than I have, because our Venn diagram just didn't overlap, especially with regards to some facts about the economy. So yeah, no, I completely disagree about the mainstream media being disconnected, but also them being disconnected from the mainstream media has its impact in what they think. Anyway, that was quite, as you say, stark.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Karen, the way you mentioned the way facts are interpreted or facts are used. There's an internal email series that we have that actually Sarah Roger writes for our staff, and we call it strike 3 or ball 4. And the idea is, if you're, and this can apply to any sports, but if you're a baseball fan, if it's a 3-2 pitch and the pitcher reels back and they fire that pitch in and the batter doesn't swing, if you're rooting for the pitcher, you scream strike 3. If you're rooting for the batter, you scream ball 4. It's the same exact fact. The same situation happened. The ball left the pitcher's hand and it landed in the catcher's mitt. But depending on your worldview, in other words, are you rooting for the pitcher's team or are you rooting for the batter's team, how you interpret that situation is completely different. It can cause you to shout something completely different. It's the same thing with in football. Is it holding or is it a really good block? Is it offensive pass interference or is it defensive pass interference? It's kind of all in the sort of eye of the beholder, and you have to understand and respect their worldview, where you're coming from, to sort of realize that. It's a really fun email series. There's a lot of material out there to choose from.
I think that's certainly true, but there also is, facts are actually facts, and you know, the ball was in the strike zone or it wasn't, you know. But it's, you know, some facts like was that a hold can be super difficult to determine, and that's kind of where the trouble comes in, isn't it?
Yeah, and every umpire strike zone is going to be different too, right? That's part of why I hate baseball so much, because it's so subjective. I want just the facts. So Alan, or welcome Craig to our discussion. Anybody else who hasn't weighed in yet, what are your takeaways? What are your big thoughts?
I love baseball. So besides that, to me, the great the predisposition of the audience or of the people in the book, and how do you get past any predisposition? I know the concept of facts, but how do you make somebody go to facts? And who am I to say that website is wrong and that site is reliable? It's a challenge, but to the, yes, we're here, nobody's listening to us. They have the materials in front. They should have access to materials. How do you make them go there? How do you know that they're going there and not just reacting to gut or predisposition? The book is an eye-opener for me on trying to go behind the thought process, but then I'm seeing some gaps, or I'm seeing something needs to be addressed, and I don't know yet how to do that. Maybe I'll just need to keep on reading. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, that's it. And we kind of, when we spoke with Brad and Selena last week, a few of our questions did involve, you know, where are these, one thing we really wanted to know from our end is, where are these voters getting their information? Is it primarily the internet? Is it primarily newspapers? And, you know, they responded that the local newspapers, they're all going out of business, so there's not that sense of community newspaper that there used to be. I know for me, I even with my age, I still grew up with a countywide newspaper, and that's disappeared now, and it's harder to get that connection of how national news affects your daily life, and it's become a lot more difficult for sure. And it's an interesting angle, especially with this group of voters and citizens. Who else would like to chime in?
This is Alan, and as I said earlier, I haven't cracked the book open, but I have a liberal progressive viewpoint, but realize most people that I come in contact do very little research in pursuing a decision that's outside their immediate concerns. They react to the flow that they're plugged into. And 300 people being interviewed would not be a random sampling, and those sorts of, I guess you say, scientific review criteria is insightful, though, just to have 300 conversations, even if they were in the same town. So a book like this can provide insight for opposing views or even parallel views. But I think the big issue is the superficial nature that most of us take in America as citizens. Those of us participating in this phone conversation chose to be here very particularly. 4 of you because it's your job. And it makes it fun. It keeps us going. It makes us want to learn more. But what about the guy who never is going to read this book because he's not going to engage himself in a deeper philosophical thought of his choices for an election? That's the content is interesting to a minority, and we're going to churn over therefore we should assume this. Why are we looking at these 300? Well, why aren't we looking at some other 300? It would be interesting to have the compare and contrast book, in my mind, for us to really see the difference of value systems, the difference of informational intake, the differences of life situations, and how we vote on those type of criteria. But I'm looking forward to finishing the book.
Alan, what you just said made me think of something, and I do think you'll enjoy the book, so you should try to get, through several of the different archetypes. You'll love the interviews. But what you were saying about people not going on that much information and just going with the flow, I think is 100% true. And we just see that all around us. But what was really striking about so many people in the book was that they grew up Democrats, and like their parents were Democrats and their grandparents were Democrats. They were long Union families, or, I mean, from the part of the country they were coming from, that all makes sense. But the fact that they didn't then go with the flow, that they made a completely different choice and a completely different break, and they each had their own reason for that, was completely surprising, because you do expect people to just kind of, I've always voted Democrat, so it's decided. So the reasons people had for making a different choice, I thought were a completely interesting thread throughout almost all the people. So yeah, Alan, you just made me think of that, and a completely interesting part of the interviews.
Yeah, I love this. For some reason, it's reminding me of a conversation I just recently had with my mother about how this is a pretty seismic shift for a lot of those voters who did go from probably Obama to Trump. And similarly, when she was growing up in the 50s and 60s, a lot of her generation, born in the late 40s, were voting religiously for Democrats, for Kennedy. That was, I think, many of their first elections. And then as you got into the 70s and 80s, a whole large group of them flipped and what was causing that. And it's kind of a similar thing that we're seeing here is, okay, well then will this group in a post-Trump world after 2020, if he runs again, or in 2024, will they continue to vote Republican? Will Trump have shifted them permanently, as many of those JFK voters did eventually shift permanently to Republican? Oh, I mean, it's a really interesting thing to think about, especially when you look at these archetypes. And like Karen, you brought up that they were religious Democrats, and we saw their reasonings for switching to Trump. Is it transient, or will that stick?
I am a retired natural resource professional. That's kind of where I'm leaning from. And I was horrified that the elections went the way they went. And I've tried to understand why people voted for Trump. How can they face themselves in the mirror? He's so despicable. And I have never been able to have a really good response to my question to people. They get just really defensive, and they want to, and they can't get deep on the subject, and they skip around from one sound bite to another. So for me, the book was, I loved the organization, how they broke them into the archetypes. And I didn't agree with everything that people said, but it was just great to hear the other side. And it makes me more tolerant now.
I love the way you just said that, Nancy, because that's something that we constantly think about when we're publishing our articles, and when we're thinking about all of you and our other millions of readers. Is we see this in our readers, that they're genuinely curious people who are interested in understanding the other side, and who genuinely want to understand what the other side thinks and says about an issue. There's a sort of terminology we like to say internally to ourselves, that we like to think of ourselves as the level-headed voice in the room. So people aren't shouting at each other. They're capable of just engaging in real civil discourse, in a real civil conversation. So we can totally understand exactly where you're coming from, Nancy, and I hope we're able to help you and help others along with that at times.
I think we have 2 people calling in over phone. Any thoughts from you guys? For those of you who are coming at a different perspective than the archetypes, was there anything within these archetypes that you could relate to that was particularly relatable for you?
I'm an entrepreneur, so I always love reading about other people's businesses and how they started their businesses and how they're getting by. So that was pretty relatable for me.
I actually found the Rotary Reliable section somewhat relatable, just because I grew up in a very rural area. And so I can kind of even like feel in myself like the difference in the way that I speak and attitudes that I take when I'm visiting home versus like when I'm here in Seattle in a bigger city. So yeah.
I saw our 2 phone-in participants unmute at one point, so I'll see if you guys want to try one more time. There's a 209 area code and an 814 area code. We'll give you guys the open floor if you want to see if your phones are working.
It looks like the icon was making sound. There's little green lights coming out of it, but we can't hear you if you are talking. I'm not sure what's going on with that.
Yeah, apologies for the technical difficulties there. If you were trying to talk, we'd be happy to share along some email thoughts once we're done with this call if unfortunate technical circumstances are interfering.
Yeah, so I guess just one final question for everybody. What was your, does this change how you will relate to people on a daily basis? That's what I'm most curious about.
Hi, this is Nancy again. As I said in my other remarks, it's totally has changed how I interact with people, and I can hear now what they're saying. Now that I see the themes of these archetypes, it helps me realize what people are saying. So it was definitely a worthwhile read.
Nancy, I bet the authors would be so delighted to hear that. As someone who splits her time between Denver and England, I don't get much time to interact. I don't have very many opportunities to interact with the people described in that book. So I don't think it's going to affect me on a day-to-day basis, but I also really feel like I have more of an understanding and kind of reassured that people, although that people had a good reason. Well, a reason at least, right? Like a reason is something, because it was pretty so shocking and hard to understand right at first.
It changed for me as well in the perspective of not wanting to judge right away. And on top of that, wanting to understand more, kind of like maybe help get into a common thought stream that would shed light to some answers.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just a good reminder of at the end of the day, we're all just people, and there's a handful of things that we all typically want. We want a roof over our heads, food on the table, a job. So despite a lot of differences, we're all just people aiming for the same things. So it's a good reminder to treat people well and actually listen to their concerns, because we have common goals. We're just going about them differently typically. So it's just always a good reminder to do more listening in my day-to-day life versus talking at people. So that's what I took away from that.
That was really nicely put.
Great. Well, I think we'll get wrapped up here. We had carved out 30 minutes. This was our first attempt at this. We're deciding what next books we're going to do, and you'll be getting an invitation to any future book clubs. But if you want to keep the conversation going, please feel free to email us or tweet at us, whatever you'd like. But it was really great having everybody here. If you haven't finished the book, please do, and I'd be happy to send along any feedback you have to Selena and Brad, and I know they'd love to hear it. So thanks again for joining today, and keep in touch.
Yeah, thanks so much for taking time out of your day, everyone. This was really fun. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you.
Thank you.